The author George Bernard Shaw once said, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on unreasonable men." I would like to contend today that Jesus is the unreasonable man. What do I mean by that? Over the last few weeks, Jesus has been dropping some bombs. He's been asking some very unreasonable things of his disciples. A few weeks ago, we heard Jesus say, "Hate your mother and your father." A few weeks later, we heard, "Make friends for yourself with dishonest wealth." Just last week, we heard, "Be poor in this life to be rich in the next." These things seem pretty unreasonable. And so these poor apostles, confused and challenged by what they're hearing, ask for an increase in faith. And Jesus replies by being unreasonable once again. He says, "Go throw trees into the ocean and work to exhaustion, work some more, and don't expect a thank you in return." Pretty tough. Obviously, there's more than meets the eye going on here. You see, our problem is that we don't really understand what faith is. I think that we can tend to think of faith as a sort of divine gasoline, a magical trust in God juice that he pours into our cups so that we can just have no worries in our hearts, and we can just know that everything's going to be okay even during tough times. The difficult and sometimes confusing truth is that faith is not blind. Faith is not blind. It's more radical than covering your eyes and trusting that God is good even when things seem really bad. Faith is looking at that wild and painful and unreasonable thing that is before us and trusting that even there, God is still God. The Catechism defines faith this way. It says, "Faith is first of all a personal adherence of man to God. At the same time, it's a free assent to the whole truth that God has revealed." So, two parts. First part, adherence of man to God. Second part, a free assent, a belief in the whole truth that God has revealed. St. Jerome puts it this way: Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And so our faith is the way that we respond to the power and wisdom of God. That we submit ourselves to the power and the wisdom of God. Jesus is unreasonable insofar as he demands that we bend to his power, that we assent to his wisdom. That can be a difficult thing to do. The Catechism goes on a little bit further. It says, "By faith, man completely submits his intellect and will to God. The whole being of man gives assent to God." When God's plans seem unreasonable to us, when they stand before us, when reality stands before us and it seems impossibly unreasonable, there's no way God could want this, faith demands that we stand firm, that we stare that in the face, and trust that God is still God. This is an unreasonable request of God. In fact, it is impossible for us to do unless we trust in an actual person, unless we know and trust in the unreasonable one himself. Our second reading today is from the second letter of Timothy, and it cuts out a little middle section. In this middle section of the letter, we hear Paul say, "I know him in whom I have believed, and am confident that he is able." I know him in whom I have believed. Faith is not some divine gasoline. It's not magical trust juice. It is the relationship that we have with the one who seems so unreasonable to the world, who demands that the world bends to his will, to his plan, to his salvation. Faith is accepting the reality of a relationship that goes beyond our comprehension, that surpasses reason, that builds on reason, yes, but goes beyond what we can understand with our limited scope and vision of this world and this life. With faith, we can respond to the unreasonable master with trust, knowing that he is God and we are not. We can respond as his sons and daughters rather than his slaves. We can respond with a spirit of service rather than a spirit of servitude. And we can trust that God is indeed almighty. Faith is Mary standing at the foot of the cross, trusting that evil will not win the day. Faith is sitting by the sickbed of a loved one, with trust that God will bring healing to mind, body, and soul according to his perfect will. Faith is looking at the railroad crossing where a 10-year-old died, and knowing that though death has taken him, it doesn't get to keep him. God is unreasonable. Jesus is unreasonable in what he asks of us. He's unreasonable to ask faith of us. He demands and asks that we bend ourselves, that we bend our understanding of the world, and we bend our will and our intellect around his. He's unreasonable, and he asks us to be unreasonable too, not to bend our understanding according to the understanding of the world, but to trust that he has us in his hands, to trust that divine providence is indeed perfect, to trust that God's unreasonable is more perfect than the reason of this world.